Hi everyone, welcome to Off the Podium. I have a special guest today, James Gardner from New Zealand. Hi James, welcome.
Hi Tigran, nice to be here.
Well, we'll start with the generic question. I know I say this every time in my podcast, but a little bit about your start in music and your early career.
Okay, well I think it's not a bad place to start because you get a lot of different answers. I think for me, it's pretty haphazard. I didn't come from a particularly musical family or anything like that. I was born in Liverpool and grew up in a town about 8 miles away from Liverpool called Maghull, Maghull, which is a pretty unremarkable kind of town, really. And I just picked up bits and pieces of music along the way, really. I've never really been a particularly good performer. The only instrument I've performed on reasonably well is the bass guitar, and that comes a bit later in the story, perhaps. But I played, the usual stuff. I did a bit of recorder at school, and like most people, I could pick it up by ear, and I saw some notation that way, but I basically just followed whether it went up or went down. And then moved on to things like I played drums in the Boys Brigade and the bugle in the Boys Brigade, just the kind of normal stuff. Moved on to bass guitar when I was about 14. Very haphazard, no particular schooling. I've never been really taught anything about music. Like Mark Yeats, who you were talking to the other day, I don't actually have any qualifications in music at all on paper. So a lot of it's been self-taught over the years, thanks to also public libraries and Radio 3 in the UK, things like that. So very haphazard and piecemeal, which means there are still big gaps in my education, which I'm, constantly trying to sort of fill.
Yeah. Well, you said something, I read something about programming keyboards for a variety of artists. What was that about, if you don't mind?
That's right. Well, I left Maghull in 1982, and I was about 20 and moved to London.
Mm-hmm.
And it's too long to go into, too boring probably, but gradually got involved by the mid-80s, I was programming synthesizers in studios and for live bands, because I'd always had an interest in synthesizers from my mid-teens, and I seemed to take to it very quickly. That is one thing I seem to have a knack for, being able to hear a sound, think how you could do it, and kind of make the machines get there. So during the mid-80s, there was a bit of a sort of role for people who programmed synthesizers but didn't necessarily have to be particularly good keyboard players, and I certainly was never a particularly good keyboard player. Obviously, in bands, you don't necessarily have to be Andras Schiff to be able to cut it, so with my minimal keyboard technique, I was the least worst in the band, I think. I was able to get by, but my main strength was actually making the sounds in those days. And so that was part of what I did through the mid-80s into, I guess, the very early 90s.
Yeah, well, something else that came up and I read about was the Apollo 440 band or project that you were involved with. How did that come about? How did that all get started? I listened to a few recordings. You probably weren't playing in the ones I heard, but because the band is still around from what I understand. But
they're still around in some form. I think they're kind of quiescent, but they're still around in some form. Basically what happened was it was some old school friends of mine, Howard Gray and Nocco, or Norman Fisher-Jones and Trevor Gray. We'd all been working on various projects during the 1980s, and occasionally our paths had crossed. I'd been in bands with Nocco, most notably a band called The Umbrella, and then we were together with Pete Shelley, and then I played with Luxuria with Howard Devoto. I was the keyboard player and synth guy for that for a while, and we decided that we should pool our resources and sort of form a group just to sort of follow our nose. And this is the beginning when dance music was becoming mainstream, I guess. And I think we were intrigued partly in the technology, but also the phenomenon of dance music. And it allowed us to sort of indulge some of our interests as well, and also keep a sense of, I think, rock music drama, which is certainly where we came from. We'd all been when in our early teens, we'd all been big fans of Deep Purple and Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and stuff like that. And there's a sense of drama that comes from that, which I think was able to be translated to some of the sort of dynamics that we put into Apollo, certainly in the early days, and then obviously they took it on later after I left. So that's sort of how I got involved in that. I left that because I started to get a bit tired of the restrictions of the format. It's certainly seemed to be very restricted in what you could and couldn't do. And I don't know what London's like now, but I suspect it's not too different. But one was always a bit of a slave to fashion. And I felt a bit restricted there. Plus, at the same time, I was getting much more interested in writing notated compositions. The breakthrough for me really was the 1991 Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival, where I had a piece which was a joint, was a runner-up in the Young Composers competition. It was the last year I was eligible to enter for that, and that was enough to spur me that maybe I can do this thing. And so there was a bit of a friction. Not really aesthetically, but just in terms of what I wanted to do. And I was getting more and more interested in writing notated music, and at that time less interested in spending time in the studio, even though I really love being in studios. I love studios. Does that answer your question at all?
That answers it. It's perfect. It's great. I actually want to just get into what you do now and the compositions, but before that, what prompted the move to New Zealand from England?
Well, there are some kind of personal factors behind that. My now wife, we were together but not married at the time. There was an opportunity to come to New Zealand, and things were winding down for me in England. I was kind of a bit not doing very much, and there was some. My first marriage had split up, and that was pretty unpleasant. And there was an opportunity to come to New Zealand and just give it a go. I think we originally were intending to come here for a couple of years and see what happened. And now it's been 22 going on 23, so we're here. I must explain, my wife is a Kiwi, so that was important. But my brother also lives in Auckland, completely coincidentally.
Wow.
And so I already had a sort of bit of family here by the time when we came out at the end of 1994. So that's sort of how. So it was a bit of a new start. I mean, I had no idea what I was going to do when I came here. It was a complete jump into the unknown, really, but it's worked out well.
So how do you, going to your compositions, and we'll get to the radio broadcast, the shows that you've done on radio, which are absolutely fascinating and very well prepared. And me doing this, I feel so... I feel terrible for doing this because it's not at the high quality that you've produced with your shows. It's absolutely amazing. I mean, there's so much to learn from them, and for people who haven't, I hope they actually listen to those because it's really well made. The compositions, how did you get started as someone who didn't have the formal training? Where did you even start with just composing, and what do you do now? How do you compose now? Just about your compositions.
Well, thanks for asking. The origins, I was thinking about this earlier today, and in a way I can't quite remember how it went, but I do remember picking up notation somehow from, God, I don't know what. I mean, I had some bass instructor books when I started learning bass guitar, and I was always in the library looking at music, not quite knowing what it meant. I'd had a little bit at school, only in as far as recorder was concerned, but I don't really know. I just kind of pieced it together. I remember certainly going to my local library and getting scores out, and then when I had access to a record library, I'd get stuff out of the record library and just see how it kind of corresponded with the sounds. And then obviously, you learn. I probably just picked up various texts about music notation from the library and just kind of figured a lot of it out myself. And obviously making terrible mistakes and all kinds of clumsinesses. I mean, I don't have a lot of the stuff I wrote in my... I suppose I started when I was about 15 or something like that. And I don't have a lot of that left. I have a couple of bits and pieces from that time. And what I would do, I would actually, because I couldn't play anything myself, I got a few people at school who could play, like grade 5 piano or a bit more. There were a couple of guys that I knew at school who played a bit of piano. And I basically notated stuff and stuck it in front of them and said, can you play this? And they would kind of struggle through it because it was all kind of awkward notation and awkward physically. But it was just the idea that there was something fascinating. I think Frank Zappa talks about this. Something about the idea of I could make these shapes on a piece of paper, give it to somebody who could deal with that, and music came out.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very powerful attraction. And obviously over the years you get, more and more finesse and more knowledge about those things. But again, Huddersfield is very important for me, the Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival. I submitted something when I was 17. The first time I went to Huddersfield, for those of you who don't know, it is a very well-known now, famous contemporary music festival. And I actually stumbled across it. The second one, I went to the second one when I was 17 in 1979, and I wasn't. As you know, I didn't study music at school, but I had a very generous art teacher who was my tutor at the time, and it allowed me to take some time off school. I was in the sixth form to go and see the Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival. And I didn't really know what it was even. I just thought, oh, that looks interesting. It's got some, new music. I'm sort of starting to get into new music. That looks vaguely interesting. And so I went along, and I didn't know anything about it really. But I submitted a piece for that, which quite rightly got rejected. But that was my first taste of writing something down. And then I went to see a few things. I saw Harry Spane, the bass clarinetist, playing Ferneyhough's Time and Motion Study 1. And that was a mind blower. And a piece by New Zealand composer Lyle Creswell. And I saw Crumb Macrocosmos and some Bartok. I can't remember now. A lot of stuff like that. And that was a real revelation that somehow I could make some kind of connection here.
Yeah.
So Huddersfield's very important in this process, but I also have to say my public libraries and just nutting stuff out, figuring stuff out, asking questions.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a very difficult question to answer. But the real lift was when that piece got chosen. I wrote a piano piece, which was accepted for the Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival Young Composers Competition, which was played by Gianna McGregor. And the judging panels, Michael Finnessy, Magnus Lindberg, and James Macmillan. And they were saying nice things about this piece of piano music of mine, and that was a huge boost to encourage me. It's like, actually, maybe the stuff I'm doing is, somebody's taking it seriously in this context. Maybe I should keep doing this stuff. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. It's great. Talk about whatever you want. I really, I like this forum because it's kind of nice to hear people talk about what they do and what they think.
A lot of it's just very unordered. I'd read about a particular composer or something, and then I'd check it out at the library, or even buy the stuff. I mean, I just used to sometimes take the plunge and buy a record because it looked interesting. Yeah, very haphazard, but gradually you get a feel for what interests you and what doesn't interest you.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like reading some of those composer encyclopedias, and you look at the name and, oh, that sounds quite interesting, and then you check it out, and actually it doesn't engage you for whatever reason. So obviously people like Frank Zappa had mentioned Varese, and I'd hear Varese, and that really engaged me. I still think that's fantastic music. Stravinsky, Bartok, all those usual kind of early 20th century composers, they really hooked me. Stravinsky, Bartok, Debussy, all that kind of stuff. And then gradually got into the more contemporary, later century stuff, very piecemeal. Yeah. At the same time as discovering more and more out there rock bands too. I mean, I was very interested in prog rock, and then when I discovered Henry Cow, that was a big big moment, I must say. Who, for anybody listening, should really check out Henry Cow's catalogue. One of the most extraordinary bands I think I've ever been. Anyway, I digress.
Well, I was gonna say talk about what you do now, and I know you teach at a college level at the university, and when most people in the U.S. or around the world, when you think of someone who teaches at the college level, you think they have, doctoral degrees and all these things. But from what I understand, you don't. But you still teach at the college level, which is great because there's so much that you've done that would be beneficial to students. How did you get the position, and what do you do? And I know you recently were traveling, so how did that go? And tell us a little bit more about that.
I must clarify, I don't actually and have never had an actual position per se. Mm-hmm. What I do is I come in and do some teaching, and I'm basically a hired hand. Mm. I don't have a position. I don't really have any ambitions to have a position, a full-time position either. I'm in the lucky position of not being the breadwinner in the house, which gives me a certain amount of flexibility that I know a lot of people don't have. I mean, a lot of people are desperate to have a tenure or whatever because it's some kind of security. Yeah. I'm in a very lucky position where I don't have to have that. But at the same time, I'm not sure I'm temperamentally suited to it either. Yeah. So what I do is I teach very particular things which I think I can do reasonably well, and that's including 20th, 21st century Western art music history, popular music, although I'm particularly focusing on the 60s and 70s, that's my strong point there, some music technology, and sort of composition. I've never been hired really properly to teach composition, although I have done some, and I've certainly never been hired to do oral theory or anything because my chops just aren't good enough, frankly. So I'm very restricted in what I can do to a certain extent, but I think I can still have something useful to offer.
Well, I did try to find some of your compositions online, and there was only one that I found, the score too. I found Charge.
Oh yeah.
And I saw that you I saw that you like extended technique, and you use a lot of extended technique in what you write. Is that for all pieces or just Charge?
Oh gosh, I'm surprised you weren't able to find more. There's more out there.
I didn't search. Really hard, but that's the one that I found the score to. I'm sure there's much more out there, but that's the
Charge
score
is just basically a little birthday piece. It's a kind of 2-page piece, which was originally written for clarinet, and it can be done in a number of. I've made versions for a number of instruments, some of which I think are more successful than others. Is that typical? Well, I suppose it is. I don't even think in terms of extended technique anymore. It just seems to be part of the language of 20th, 21st century music. It's just in the same way that the notation is just a kind of expanded version of 19th century notation, something that's continually expanding. Excuse me. And one of the things about Western music notation is that you can extend it pretty easily. You don't have to completely rewrite it to be able to extend it, and I think that's one of the reasons it's actually lasted. Obviously, there are many other ways of doing notation, and it's horses for courses, and sometimes notation's not relevant at all, of course. But is that piece typical? I suppose it is. It's become a kind of little calling card piece, oddly enough. I never meant it to be. It was literally a birthday present.
I read
to
that.
A clarinetist.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of seems to have kind of one that people pick up.
Yeah. Another question I love asking composers: do you compose for large ensemble, or is that something that you stay away from?
Depends how large is large. I used to direct a small group here in New Zealand called 175 East. And
I was going to ask you about that.
Sorry, yeah, sure. Well, in a way, that's my real education. Interacting with the players, learning how an ensemble works. That was a huge learning curve, as they say. I mean, that was a huge learning experience for me. Interacting in great detail with a lot of the players. and all the rest of it. Hugely important for me. And that was the core of that was fairly small, maybe 5 or 6 players. I have written for a large version of that, but not much more than, what's the biggest? I don't know, maybe 10 players. I suppose the question is into 2 parts. Would I like to write for larger ensembles, and do I like music made by larger ensembles? Yes, I do. But beyond a certain size of ensemble, you start to get into, I wouldn't say problems perhaps, but issues around what it means for the individual performers. I mean, the typical thing, of course, is an orchestra.
Yeah.
Where you have a huge team of basically alienated wage labourers working together, and the results can be beautiful, but you cannot expect somebody at the back of the second desks, the second violins, to be as engaged in the music as you would for, let's say, somebody in the Australian ensemble Elysian, where everyone is really committed to what they're doing.
Yeah.
100%. It's not just another gig.
Yeah.
So you run into that sort of problem. I know not all large ensembles are the same, but there is that tendency, and it is difficult. It's more difficult to keep that intensity of engagement. So I'm not sure that's a rather roundabout way of answering your question.
No, it's great. It's great.
I have written for medium-sized ensembles, but nothing for really big ensembles. There's a couple of things I've withdrawn, but I love the potential of the orchestra, but for obvious economic and social reasons, it's not always the pool of creative talent that it could be, let's say.
And what about electronic composition? I know you've done some of that as well.
I have done some, but oddly enough, I've never done a major composition in that medium, and I don't know why that is, really. I'm not sure. I think there are certain shortcomings about just presenting a piece of, even these days, presenting a piece of completely electronic music.
Yeah.
Having said that, I have got a couple of things in the pipeline which will use electronic as electronic sounds as part of a larger ensemble.
Yeah.
Thing. Which it is odd, because I'm very interested in electronic music from a historical point of view and from a technical point of view. It's just something that in my art music, if you like, I've never really explored, and I'm not sure why. I do improvise when I'm taking part in improvised groups. I do use electronics there, so that's sort of where it is in one of the many things I do. That's where it kind of comes into play.
I was going to ask you about improvisation, because as coming from a classical background, and most classical musicians really have shied away from improvisation over the past years, and it was nice to read that you improvise, but you do come from a different background, so that's more understandable.
Well, but I also think that certainly judging from what I see in the UK and here, I think there are more performers who are schooled in the art music tradition who are now improvising, and a lot of them are doing it very skillfully. Again, Elysian would be an example of that. My colleague at the University of Canterbury, Mark Menzies, would be another example of that, for instance. So I think that's shifting. I think there's a shift in focus there. I don't think it's as unusual as it used to be even 10 years ago for trained performers, if you like, to be able to improvise. From my own point of view, it's something I've done for many, many years. Even when I was at school, we had an improvising ensemble, which was pretty crude, but nevertheless, the idea of free improvisation has been there for a very, very long time in what I do. I remember discovering, Derek Bailey and Evan Park and people like that in my late teens. And even before then, again, the examples are strange. The examples of free improvisation I first came across were, again, Henry Cow, who used free improvisation in their music, and also one of the incarnations of King Crimson, the mid-70s incarnation of that with Bill Bruford and John Wetton, where they would improvise. And that was a huge eye-opener for my colleagues and I, my cohort at school who were interested in weird music. So the example of Crimson and Henry Cow was very important there. Before I then discovered, Derek Bailey, AMM, and so on, the kind of more free jazz end of things, if you want to call it that. So improvisation's been there a long way, and I still think of even the most meticulously notated compositions as a kind of extremely slow motion improvisation.
I was going to ask you about Brian Ferneyhough. I know you mentioned him briefly, but I also read that you studied with him in a masterclass setting, right?
I let's be clear, I've never studied with him per se. I attended a masterclass in Finland.
I see.
With a composition class with him, which was very instructive and very useful. And his ways of thinking about how you go about the compositional act and the ramifications of what it is you're doing are very important, and in some ways still are. But I think there's if you write music with tuplets, and you use certain kinds of instrumental techniques, there's a sort of superficial similarity. But I think my approach and where I'm coming from with my music is very, very different indeed from what Brian does. He is very much, I think, still linked as a kind of outgrowth of the Second Viennese School in some ways, although I mean that's a very restricting kind of way of looking at it. But what he doesn't have is any kind of interaction at all with popular music whatever, and I don't think that's a kind of an affectation on his part. I mean, maybe he would have to say for himself what his relationship is, but it's very different from my relationship with popular music, which has been something there since I was very young, and I've been very, very, very involved with it and very passionately devoted to it for parts of my life, and that doesn't go away. Yeah. So although what I'm doing is exclusively notated music for acoustic instruments, I think somewhere in the background, again, like I said before, there's something to do with the sort of dramatic content of some popular music forms that is still kind of at the back of your mind somehow, even though on the surface there's absolutely nothing to do with it. I don't use any kind of, there's no kind of fusion or anything like that, but I think it's sort of still in there somewhere in the DNA.
Well, going now to the show, that I was very impressed by the programs that you had on the radio. How did that come about? How were you interested in making the program and running these shows?
Here's my soapbox for public radio, which I think is incredibly important, even now in its kind of online form. Mm-hmm. It's very important to have commercial-free music shows, and the landscape has changed a lot. Yeah. But I wouldn't be where I am now, wherever that is, without Radio 3 and without what I've learned from Radio New Zealand Concert here in New Zealand. Again, I have to also thank Tim Dodd, who has been my producer on pretty much all of the shows that I've done for Radio New Zealand, and he's a real collaborator. So without him, they wouldn't be in the form they are. I pitched the idea of, I think the first one I did was the Zappa shows, a series of 5 programs, and I just contacted Tim. Tim, I knew already because Radio New Zealand had been recording the 175 East concerts. Again, very, very strong supporters of recording new music concerts. From the late 90s, and I think that's how we got in touch. And I just basically said, I'm really interested in doing some programs on Frank Zappa. Would you be interested? And basically they said, well, yeah, if you can give us a bit of some kind of shape, some kind of outline as to what you want to do, yeah, we'd be interested, and let's do it. And so that's how that happened. And since then, that was in 99, I think, or something like that. We've done quite a few different programs. Again, it wouldn't work perhaps in a larger organisation where you have a big bureaucracy. But when like a lot of things in New Zealand, it's very easy to actually get to the people, to talk to and interact with the people who are actually in charge of things. That's one of the advantages of being in a smaller country.
Yeah, they were very, very well made. I'm really impressed. And Zappa has been such an influential person for, I'm sure, many people, but for me as well. I should have worn my Zappa T-shirt today. I was talking to you.
Well, it's difficult to know. I mean, people pop out the woodwork and know things about Zappa, so it's quite interesting.
I don't know if I'll put you on the spot with this question, but for those listeners who don't know much about Zappa, or maybe know, but they don't, he did so much. There's so much music out there. What are some albums, and I know you might hate this question, but a couple of albums that come to mind that inspired you maybe in what you do, and that you would recommend?
It's funny. I mean, that I think there are 101 official releases now. That's not bootlegs. That's official releases. So it's a big catalogue. It's a bit like saying which is your favourite Scarlatti sonata or something like that. The entry point, I think, which would cover, if you had to choose one album, I think the one which would give you the most clues is probably One Size Fits All from 1975. That's often cited, but there's an awful lot in there which would take you in different directions. So it's still a songs-based album, but the instrumental passages on it are extremely complex and fantastically played. It's a wonderfully recorded album too, and it's also got Zappa's humour on it. So that would cover a lot of bases, I think. The ones that actually first, again, this part of this haphazard journey, really. My first encounter, I think, with Zappa was when I was about 13, and a cousin of mine lent me Hot Rats and Overnight Sensation. Hot Rats is an almost exclusively instrumental album from 1969, and Overnight Sensation is one of the first Zappa albums to have a lot of his scurrilous kind of lyrics, but also some fantastic playing. And I was just, as I say, blown away by those two records. I'd never heard anything like it. So that was very important. I was about 13.
Yeah.
But I think it's the breadth. It's the breadth, really, because obviously he was writing notated music before he even learned guitar, before he was a rock guitarist, and that's sometimes overlooked. And he worked in so many styles and did a lot of them well and loved those styles. He didn't see any kind of contradiction between you can write something that sounds like Webern 1 minute and then sounds like a blues shuffle the next. And I suppose that's true for me. Obviously, one is working in many different areas, and sometimes it's notated and very strict, and other times it's completely freely improvised. And sometimes I still love a decent rock song, with particularly if it's got good drumming. I have to say I'm a big fan of drummers, and that's one of the in points for me too. I really like good drumming. I just don't see a problem with having all of those things on offer. They all have their own. They all shine a light on, if you want to be pretentious about it, shine a light on the human condition in various ways. And again, coming back to one of the things that was important, I think, that was a thread on your podcast about this, the Charlotte Gill article. I'll kind of tie it back to that. The thing that really annoyed me most about that article, and I think, she's in a way become a bit of a whipping boy, which is unfortunate. But
it really is.
The thing about kind of notation, it can only be learned by, privileged white kids. I mean, that's complete bullshit. And I'm sort of living proof. I'm white, but. And what Des Oliver was saying, what Fran Wilson was saying, what Ian Pace has been saying, what Mark Yeats said. A lot of us have come from pretty ordinary backgrounds, not really privileged at all. I come from a kind of lower middle class background, or you know, nothing remarkable at all. I went to state schools, picked it up, and yeah, it just really annoys me, the idea that if you are this kind of demographic, then you ought to like this kind of music. If I can be permitted a little bit of a rant here.
No, go ahead.
I've taught in tertiary education in West Auckland, which is, you know, in many ways a kind of deprived area, kind of lower socio-economic area of Auckland. And again, there's a kind of expectation that this relates a little bit to what Joe was saying too, amongst, for instance, Māori and Pacific Island students, that there can be a view that what they really like, and it's a terribly condescending attitude, is they like reggae and hip hop, and why would they be interested in Western art music? And I think that's absolutely a terrible attitude.
Yeah.
Because I think if you have any belief in any kind of humanity, there are ways of saying, okay, there are a lot of kinds of music here, and you are barred from none of them. You should be able to get access to any of them. It doesn't mean you have to like it, but I'm not going to stop you if that's your interest. I'm not going to try and restrict you because you're from a particular area and because you're brown, that you should like reggae, and how on earth could you be interested in Stravinsky? You know, that really annoys me, because if you'd said the same for me back learning music in the 70s in Liverpool, what would I have been limited to? I don't know what that might have been at the time. Maybe rock, you know. I just find it an extremely limiting and sad view. And as many of your interviewees have said already, music notation is not actually that difficult to learn. And there are many, now more than ever. I mean, how many people are out there on the internet teaching you about notation, about how you do rhythms and all the rest of it? So that really gets my goat when it's art music particularly is presented as this kind of inaccessible, only for privileged people thing. I think it's a terrible attitude. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you said that, and it's and you mentioned that about Frank Zappa as well. He did start early composing and his interest in Western music, but unlike many, he didn't really have a formal training at a college level, say, you know, but he still produced so much great music, and his orchestral music are, you know, if I was to pick a 20th century composer, he would be among my favorites as far as composers, and he's not even considered a Western classical composer, but he definitely is one of my favorites. I was very close to writing my dissertation on Frank Zappa's orchestral music, but that things fell apart, and it would have been difficult to get any rights to a lot of his music. So
and I think in some ways he overestimated what was practically possible for an orchestra to get together. Maybe that's changing, but certainly to get a large orchestra to play those rhythmic unisons, those complex rhythmic unisons that his band could play like that, because as you know from any of the accounts of Zappa's band, they rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed in a way that you never could under current conditions with an orchestra.
Definitely,
you know, you cannot do that music with 2-3 hour rehearsals.
You can't.
It's the kind of stuff that his bands would memorize, but then they would be playing it, rehearsing for weeks on end, you know, many hours every day, and then memorize it. That's a very different proposition from getting the third oboe to play 19 in the time of 12 in unison with the rest of the woodwind section on 3 hours of rehearsal.
It's, for those who haven't seen, they have to see some of the Frank Zappa orchestra scores. It looks insane on the page. It's really fascinating.
Some of it sounds wonderful, and there are certain pieces that maybe don't work so well without going into details. But I think there are some others which are fabulous.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I find slightly odd is that it's actually not very easy to get hold of those scores to study. I don't know whether you had this problem, Tigran.
I had the problem. That's one of the reasons. I've actually, through some mentors who have previously conducted those, and I don't want to mention any names, I've had access to the scores. I don't have them with me, but I've had access to look at the scores myself. So I've seen how difficult those parts are. I've taken pictures of some of the pages of the scores, and I still have those. But it's really tough to get access to those scores, and that's the reason why I kind of put the project aside and hopefully come back to it someday. But a dream of mine is to conduct Zappa. He's truly an inspiring person for me.
I don't understand why the Zappa Family Trust, well, I don't understand a lot of the things that the Zappa Family Trust do, actually, but I don't understand why this music is not more freely available to buy and to study, because I think they're doing a real disservice. You just cannot, it's very difficult to get hold of the scores and even look at them, let alone then getting into hiring the scores and parts. I was fortunate enough to be living in London in 1983 when Kent Nagano conducted the LSO, and I went to that show live, and that was terrific. That was a fantastic set of concerts to hear, and I still have the program booklet which has some score excerpts in it, which is quite nice. And that was the only time I saw Zappa live. He conducted the encore. He conducted Strictly Gentile at the end, and so I did see him do that in his very stiff. I don't know if you've ever seen him. Conducting his extremely stiff style. Anyway, that's off topic. But.
Well, no, it's great. I mean, I love hearing about all these different things, especially from someone who actually has studied Zappa, and you did all those wonderful programs that I mentioned. Now, something outside of music. What do you do? What's life like in New Zealand outside of music? That's what I want to know.
I know you've asked this with a lot of questions. You kind of, what's your hobby? In a way, I don't really have anything that isn't in some way related to music. Pretty much everything I do in some way or other relates to music. So the research I'm doing is about the synthesizer company EMS and the studio of Peter Zinoviev, which was active through the 70s. That's still music related, even though it's a very academic research project. What else do I do? I'm not a sport person. I like walking a bit. I'm very lucky to live in a beautiful part of West Auckland. I'm looking out now. I'm surrounded by native trees, surrounded by rimu and kauri trees, which are fantastic. I'm very lucky to be living where I live, and there are a lot of wonderful walks around where we live. So I like to walk occasionally, but I'm a sport-free zone. I have zero interest in sport. I do like movies. I'm particularly interested in. I'm a big 60s and 70s movies fan, and that's kind of what really sort of gets me going. And also some really lousy 70s British TV series, but I love them anyway. 60s and 70s TV series. But I'm interested also in the soundtracks to a lot of those things. So there's always a kind of musical thread in a lot of these things. I don't think there's very much I do which has got nothing at all to do with music in some, or sound in some form. Anything
else you want to talk about that we've missed that you wanted to touch on?
Well, I suppose some of the music I'm doing now. Again, I'm very lucky to be at the University of Canterbury, where I teach from time to time. I do have some wonderful colleagues. Mark Menzies, a violinist, and Justin DeHart, who's a percussionist, has just arrived. So I'm looking forward to working with them. The current piece I'm working on is for alto, trombone, and violin, which is a slightly strange combination. And one of the things I've been getting into more recently is some just intonation tunings. Now, I know a lot of people are doing that, but I think it's a very interesting area. I'm not an intonation cult kind of guy who believes that particularly, there's some kind of cosmic cosmic significance about just intonation, and that's the one true path, and we'll all vibrate in a particular frequency and be lovely, which is there's a kind of quasi-mystical, quasi-religious overtone to some of that stuff, which I don't particularly buy, but I think just sonically it's very interesting, and you can hear the difference. So I'm looking at exploring that. The scordatura for the violin in that case is based on harmonics of an E flat from the alto trombone. That's still on the workbench, so I'm not sure how that's going to go, but I'm very excited about the prospect of having such great musicians to write for.
Yeah.
And also the idea of handing over some of the musical decisions to them, because they are both, in all of the players that I'm writing for, there are two duets. Mm-hmm. There's Mark and Matt Barbier in LA, who I don't know if you know, he's a trombonist in LA. And the two Australian musicians, Graham Jennings and Ben Marks, all improvise. So these are all improvisers, and 3 of the 4 players are also composers themselves. Oh. So I think that puts you in a slightly different position with regard to the interpreters, than in that you can trust them to do certain things. Yeah. And the thing for me is I'm generally a kind of a bit control freaky about my notation, and what I really wanted to do is to allow me to let go and hand over some of the musical decision making to the performers, because I know I can trust them with it. So that's one thing. I suppose there is a slight aside. Oh, sorry, did you want to come in on that?
No, go ahead.
Okay. There is an interesting aside, perhaps, which relates to the piano piece that I wrote, Displacement Activities. I think I sent. Did I send you the score?
Yes. With Solvik playing. With Solvik premiering it, is that the one?
That's right. Yeah. That was written for an Armenian, Lebanese, American pianist called Zovig Markarian. And how do I frame this? Okay. Well, I wrote the piece. It's a piece for a pianist who also speaks, and there are also some minor electronic components to it and field recordings. And at one point, the pianist turns on a radio and tunes into whatever's local. I mean, it's all about the pianist being displaced and not speaking necessarily in their own tongue when they're speaking English. It's the 4 pianists I had in mind when I wrote it. None of them, only one of them had English as a first language. So I was playing with let's bring the identity of the performer into the foreground here. So normally if you go to a concert, okay, you maybe read the performer's bio, but you don't get their story at all. So it was a kind of way of bringing in the performer's biography into the piece a little bit. And one of the interesting things that happened there, and this is to do with the way that sometimes inadvertently you can pick up on something that's significant that you hadn't realized. And one of the things that was interesting about working with Zovig on this piece was that she had been born in Watwat, near Beirut, in the Lebanon, and grew up during the war there. And what I hadn't realized that I'd suggested that she go and buy a radio to do the piece, and she was very excited about going and buying a radio. I didn't really know why. It seemed a pretty ordinary kind of thing to me. But she explained that during the war, they had no power, no electricity, and the radio for her was a real lifeline to what was going on. Wow. And that was a very interesting resonance for her. It didn't have that kind of resonance for me at all. Radio was just had a completely different set of associations. But I wrote that in not knowing just how significant that was for her in war-torn Beirut, which is a hell of a different experience from my notions of what radio is. And so that brought her experience into the piece, and I think that was very, very interesting. Similarly, a newer piece I've just finished called Nakashima Burl, which is for string trio and bassoon, which hasn't been played yet. When I wrote that piece, I knew that George Nakashima, who's the Nakashima of the title, wood sculptor, American-Japanese wood sculptor, actually from Washington State. And so this is getting very digressive.
Oh, no worries, no worries. This is what's this about. Go ahead.
Well, it turns out that at all intended to have any political resonance at all. It was just a purely musical response to his woodwork and the idea of these boards, these kind of wonderful patterned woods. But of course, he was part of the group of Japanese people in America who during the war were put in internment camps in America. And that was I was writing the piece, I think, when Trump got in and there was all of that sort of what do we do with immigrants and all of that kicked off. So it's interesting how some of the things that you don't think have any political resonance at all end up taking on some sort of incidental political relevance. And I think that's a very interesting thing to observe. Neither of those pieces were political in inverted commas. But the way things turn out, they can often, for a particular performer or a particular situation, take on these resonances. And I think that's interesting to play with without necessarily writing explicitly political music with a big tub-thumping text.
Sometimes I hope that my conversations with the people I talk to, there's so many fascinating things they talk about, and sometimes I just wish the meat and all this amazing things that we end up talking about towards the end of the conversation happens towards the beginning of the conversation. But it's great. It just somehow it just starts slow, but then it builds into something that I actually want it to start as. But this is great, and I hope that I have you back sometime and further talk about these things. I hope I do that with some of my past guests, because we will start at a different place, having known each other already. So
that would be lovely. I think it's really interesting that a lot of your guests have ended up talking about non-musical things, and I think what's interesting about that is it shows you perhaps just how wide-ranging and the job of an active musician is within society. We are not just in our rooms writing music. We are engaged in various ways, in our different ways. The same with you. I mean, I think it's really interesting that what you said on your website about working with community orchestras and student orchestras. And the fact that they're so much more committed to what they're doing. Okay, they may not have the chops of, the Berlin film, but what's going on is actually it can be much more intense and also plugged into the local community in a way. And I think that's often overlooked. Again, that's another thing that irritates the hell out of me, with the attitude that it's all about privileged white people. If you go and look in community orchestras and community choirs and all the rest of that, you're speaking to a different community altogether. And I think that's a really interesting thing of what you're doing.
Thank you so much. It's been great, James. I've had a great time chatting with you, and hopefully we'll do this again at some point.
That would be lovely, and I'm sorry I waffled on at all kinds of other things too much.
No, this is great. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.